very nice area
of him. So Bill Stowe is the CEO and General Manager of Des Moines Water Works, the regional utility that protects public health and promotes economic development by delivering outstanding quality water affordably in reliable quantities. BMWW works closely with business, environmental, consumer, and agricultural leaders to advocate for better stewardship of water resources and clean water initiatives throughout the entire central of Iowa, state of Iowa. Mr. Stowe is a Phi Beta Kappa graduate of Grinnell College with a Bachelor of Arts and received a Master of Science in Engineering from the University of Wisconsin, a Master of Science in Industrial Relations from the University of Illinois, and a Juris Doctorate degree from Loyola University Law School. Mr. Stowe sits in on the Board of Directors of the Association of Metropolitan Water Agencies, representing the largest drinking water utilities in North America. He is a member of the American Society of Civil Engineers and a member of the Iowa Bar Association. He frequently acts through American Arbitration Association as an impartial arbitrator in resolving complex construction and commercial disputes involving public and private construction projects. Previously, Mr. Stowe worked for the City of Des Moines as the Assistant Manager of Public Works Engineering from September 1999 until September 2012, and as the Human Resources Director from September 1997 until September 1999. He was employed for 8.5 years at Mid-American Energy as the Operations Manager, Manager of Human Resources, Manager of Employee Relations, and Manager of Labor Relations. Additionally, Mr. Stowe was employed by Shell Oil as Industrial Relations Analyst, Inland Steel Industries as a Labor Relations Representative, and the National Labor Relations Board as a Field Examiner. I want to introduce and thank Bill Stowe.
It is great to be in Missouri. I had the benefit 30 years ago working in Little Egypt, coal patch in southern Illinois. I lived in Mount Vernon. My first job was in coal. I love this area. I love the kind of near south here. I lived in New Orleans for a number of years, a long way from here, but it's good to get out of Iowa every once in a while, believe me. And if you take nothing else from my remarks tonight, I hope you take this. You do not want to be like Iowa. I know that the larger farm community, the larger agribusiness community puts Iowa up as this city on the hill. Well, I'm going to talk with you, at least from my perspective, as a fifth-generation Iowan, that we are not a city on the hill. Particularly when it comes to hog confinement issues, we are exactly what you have been fighting against. And I have to say, thank you for having me. Thanks for the great meal. What great folks down here. It is, again, a pleasure to be here. But I have a couple of apologies. One apology I have that I tried to straighten it out. I promise industrial agriculture is not a treat. It is a threat to rural America. My apology first for that. But second, I am from Iowa, and in Iowa, we owe wildlife an apology. Our state has been completely changed in a way that Missouri has not, to the detriment of the environment in Iowa. Driving down here, I've forgotten how beautiful trees can be. I live in the center part of the state that looks like a huge industrial garden. And I'm from that area and have lived in that area for most of my life. And certainly my ancestors before me have lived around and come back to it. But we are not something you want to emulate in terms of land use. We used to be a beautiful prairie state. And now we're a cultivated agricultural state. The trees we had have been removed to our detriment, and now we are 23 million acres or so of row crops with a lot of confinements, and we'll talk about that. I am from where the Red Star is, I'm old enough to think Red Star has some bad connotations. I am the capital city. Affluent customers, as was mentioned in the intro, we're a growing part of the state of Iowa. We are like Iowa City and Cedar Rapids, which is a little bit closer to all of here. We are a growing community, really in a state that is dying in many ways. Just exactly what you do not want to see happening here in Missouri. We have 23 million acres of row crops, as I mentioned. We're also the home of Eichelberger, I hope I said that correctly, Farms. They're the folks who are trying to site a facility here. Iowa has 3 million people. We have 21 million hogs. And that has been the situation in a growing relationship between more hogs and less people as long as I can remember. And clearly, you reach a point where there has to be some reasonable balance between the number of animals in a community and its environmental consequence. We'll talk a little bit about that. You know, we talk about, and I've talked to several of you today about how dry it is down here. We have a tendency to think that water is something that comes and goes with droughts. It's a quantity issue. I live in an area that's substantially, I think, wetter than it is here. At least this year, that's certainly the case. And we are water poor also because the water quality is so horrible. This map is from our friends at National Geographic, and it tends to think of things in terms of water issues and water quantity. Believe me, it's coming from an area that has a lot of water quantity. We're still water scarce because the water quality, surface water quality in my state is absolutely horrible. One of the okay, sorry, a bit of too heavy of a touch, more ways than one perhaps. One of the concerns that I have as a Midwesterner, and I hope that you think about, if not share, is we don't want to become a sacrifice state or a model of agriculture that's failing. I think of West Virginia as an example. Again, I spent some years in the coal business, and that is a state that's been left devastated by a model that's failed. The model there was big coal. The model that I fear in my state, and I'm sure you fear here, is one of industrial agriculture. This is, if you can see the inset, we have unique drainage issues in Iowa that I'll talk about. You are becoming a confinement state, unfortunately, much like what I see in my home state in West Virginia. Again, devastated by huge economic interests, social and political interests that really don't care about what happens to small towns like yours. So be on guard. You're already on guard. Thank you for what you've done in your litigation. I'm going to talk about litigation we've been involved in where we were on the losing side, but you're staying with it. It takes courage, it takes persistence, and it takes a vision, because the legal system will often push through a ringer and throw you out, but you have to stay resilient in the process. We are also survivors of that process, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Do it a little differently. Here's my concern. We are seeing at the state level in my state a continued reluctance for any local home rule issues involving CAFOs. You're seeing the same thing here. In my state, it has been taken away from what you call county commissioners, but we call county supervisors. It's been taken away from local governments and given to the state. That's a horrible problem. It's a horrible problem that you've seen in your litigation and we're seeing in ours. We have seen basically a proliferation of combined animal and confined animal feeding lots in Iowa by over 100% in the last few years. The Smithfields is an example, and others are coming in and essentially exporting our natural resources, our corn and our animals to China. Who is the ambassador to China? Anybody know? Terry Branstad, former Republican governor in my home state of Iowa. All kinds of unusual things going on in terms of international trade right now. Obviously, the president has opened up all kinds of uncertainties in areas of soybeans and corn and hogs with tariff discussion. That may be an opportunity for those of you who want to stand up against confinements to add more uncertainty into the markets. Obviously, there are business decisions that are being made, multi-million-dollar business decisions that are being made, with perhaps a more optimistic view of what's going on in markets than will exist in a month or 6 months. There are decisions that are being made, trade wars, if you will, and tariffs that will have a huge impact on those decisions and a huge impact on small towns like yours, no matter how they cut. Operating in a vacuum without talking with your state legislators, without talking to your U.S. senators and United States representatives, I think is something you have to push back against. I know you have a senatorial election here. You have significant uncertainty in your governor's office. Even I know that, living 250 miles west of here. There's going to be change in Missouri just like there's going to be change in Iowa. Sometimes that change is negative, sometimes it's positive, but it's always an opportunity for activist groups like you to raise concerns about what the impacts are of animal feeding operations on small towns. I have seen in the local community that I've been involved in huge changes in labor force associated with animal feeding operations. There can be no missed opportunity for large corporations like Smithfield to come into areas where the corn and soybeans are raised and start feeding operations there. Contract provisions with local farmers have been anything but positive for many folks. Local labor communities, I remember working in a packing house or working around livestock were good unionized jobs. That is no longer the case. I am hard pressed to think of a single unionized packing house that I know of in my state anymore. The demographics have changed. Our populations in smaller towns are aging. The cities are getting younger. The economic wealth is moving to the cities and suburbs and away from small towns, and that's all part of this process of consolidation of industrial agriculture and moving towards larger feeding operations are certainly a part of that. Let me tell you a little bit about the litigation that we've been involved in so you can have a sense of what's out there as you try to push forward with appeal process or look at new litigation. We were involved in litigation that essentially said that feeding operations and row crops that were tiled, in my area of the United States, farm fields are heavily tiled, we're wet, and our soils retain water. To be able to allow the corn root zone to be productive, you have to tile it. And on 10 by 10 centers, from where I am in the middle of the state all the way to Minnesota, those farm fields are tiled, and they're taking water at about 4 feet of depth laterally into the waters of the state. They're moving a lot of water and a lot of pollutants, a lot of nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus in particular, into the waters of the state. We're surface water providers, as are most large cities, St. Louis, Kansas City. I don't know about Columbia. Are they a surface water provider? Not surprising, most larger cities are. When you're a surface water provider, what happens, particularly at the surface, is extremely important to water quality. So if you live in an industrial ag area like I do, heavily, intensively farmed row crops and in confinements, then we have really poor quality of water through things like bacteria, through things like nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus, nitrate in particular, and we're seeing something now called cyanobacteria, a process where algae now is providing a toxin in surface waters that are very, very difficult to manage. Toledo, Ohio, the Great Lakes have had them for a number of years. It's now moving to my area of the Midwest, hopefully not to yours. We've been involved in litigation that essentially said that producers upstream for us were point source polluters. They were spilling water out of a pipe into the surface waters of Iowa. We said they should have an EPA permit to be able to do that, and that should be regulated. Our state Supreme Court essentially said that we could not bring action against another political entity. These drainage districts in my state are political entities. Your county commissioners, our board of supervisors, govern that, so they're a political entity. One government can't sue another, basically, is what our Supreme Court said. A federal judge said, in fact, that he was going to defer to the Iowa Supreme Court. So our litigation, after 2 or 3 years, and after our governor, our legislature, and both of our senators condemning us for being, Red Star terrorists, whatever it may be, who are trying to push environmental agendas over the great agricultural success of our state. not recognizing the environment and agricultural success should go together, not apart. We became pilloried in a whole bunch of additional political issues. Our legislature actually had legislation to actually remove the Des Moines Water Works as a political entity from the state and break it up and take it and throw it around to all the cities in the immediate area. That was beaten back largely because of another industrial issue. I actually, the area that I live in, the county that I live in, has about $6 or $8 billion of server farms. Server farms are that warehouses where IT servers for Facebook, for Apple, and for Microsoft are placed in our jurisdictions. They use a little bit of water, but billions of dollars in tax revenues going into those. Interrupting their water service became another political issue where those big names like Apple and Facebook and Microsoft said, "Thou shalt not," and pushed back to some degree against the industrial ag issues that were trying to get at us. So we survived, obviously, or I probably wouldn't be talking with you today. But the point that I would give to you in a very general way out of litigation like that you've been involved in here is don't underestimate your enemies and don't overestimate your friends. The enemies out there are well funded. They're huge corporate conglomerates with huge political strength in your legislature and your governor's mansion, just like ours. The Iowa Farm Bureau, a huge political force in my state, having disproportionate power, both the Democratic and Republican parties. They essentially decide who stays in the legislature and who doesn't. They are a very important Blarney Stone to kiss if you want to stay in the state legislature. They are obviously very much on the other side of the kind of issues that you and I are talking about. They're a very potent political force. They ran a $1 million TV ad against my organization. They had black and white pictures of me, essentially saying I was a Bolshevik and an urban Catholic or whatever the hell they were putting out there. Some of which is probably true, but the urban Catholic is true at least. The Bolshevik is not. But you will see and have seen that kind of interest in your litigation already. You will see more of that. Many of you, I'm sure, have done a great job of building networks and partnerships. Your friends can be intimidated in the process. We had a number of friends in the environmental community, some in the ag retail community that were intimidated and kind of fell off the advocacy plate working on our behalf, on environmental behalf in the process. So don't overestimate your strength for your friends and do not underestimate your enemies. If you continue in an appeal process or start a new action again, I haven't talked to your attorney on what he's thinking about or what you all are thinking about. These are steep hills to climb, but they're necessary. Look at the beautiful quality of life you have here in this community in Callaway County. This is terrific. This will change if many more confinements come in. I happen to live in a county that's big enough where the suburbanization, frankly, has pushed all that out. Very little in the immediate area that I live in the 4 or 5 counties that the 500,000 customers that I work for work in. But right upstream from us, where some of the most productive corn land is in the country, the confinements keep rolling in. We have 2 multi-million-dollar confinements in our watershed that are being constructed right now. There's some concern from them or some opportunity for us that the uncertainties in the pork markets right now or the soy markets may cause them to step back. Hopefully that kind of uncertainty will hit you here in what you're facing in your continued litigation. But here's the real point. Don't be like Iowa. We're number 1 in corn. We're number 1 in hogs. We're number 1 in eggs. But we're also number 1 in surface water pollution. We're a state where public health risks are very real and becoming more real as time goes on because too much stuff is coming into our surface water. Fulton, I know, takes its water from deep wells. That's great for smaller towns. A lot of smaller towns in my state do the same thing, but that's a limited resource. That's glacial water, right? It doesn't recharge very well. That's what you're seeing in Texas and in California. More and more of that's being taken out, and less of it is able geologically to replenish. So there's going to be increasing water shortages in many communities that are associated with that. The big cities, mine, St. Louis, Columbia, and it sounds like Columbia, and I know Kansas City, are surface water providers. We are hostages to what happens in our watershed upstream. CAFOs are a net reduction to environmental positives. If you've ever been around a CAFO, and I'm old enough that I'm from the Ames area. Remember when Iowa State and Mizzou were both in the Big Eight? Wow. I lived in Louisiana for a number of years. I'm still trying to program the idea that you're in the SEC conference here. It just didn't fit for me, but I grew up when hogs were pastured primarily, and livestock was pastured. I was on the cusp coming home from college in the late 70s and early 80s of building confinements. Those confinements, are like machine sheds now, tool sheds, were the real confinements that are out there. They're huge. And a pretty good map to show you of my state and where the concentrations are at CAFOs, right around the Corn Belt in particular, in soybean areas, stretching really from just north of about Ames all the way up to the Minnesota border and then west towards Sioux City. But they're horrible on communities. Anybody who tells you that but for a few producers and but for a few ag retail people, that it's good for mom and dad or families in those small communities, it is not. They're very mechanized, the jobs are very hazardous, and they're non-union. And if you've been around pigs, and I know many of you have, there are real public health issues. Water quality is the one that I'm certainly most familiar with and most an advocate to push back against, but air quality issues are also very real. And if you've seen hog dust, if you have a sense of what hog dust is, it's becoming a real issue, a health issue that's causing the Iowa Sierra Club in the context of my home state to push back and say that should be a regulated particulate matter. So there's some interesting litigation going on with CAFOs in my home state. But as I look nationally at what's going on with CAFOs, and I'm sure you do too, North Carolina and Iowa obviously are the states that have the most right out there because of the concentration of animal units that we have in our state. North Carolina, very urbanized in some areas, very environmentally honed in on issues of protecting their state, has put a moratorium for several years on new construction. My state refuses to do that. There have been a number of pieces of legislation that have been offered. Again, there's no local control. You do not want to be like Iowa. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm sorry we weren't able to show you some of the pictures, but I think you know the picture pretty well. Small towns are dying. Urban areas and suburban areas are growing. To some degree, that's a demographic that eventually will push back on some of this, but many of you live here for quality of life purposes and want to continue to live here. More CAFOs that come into your county and come into this area will create significant social issues for you, not only in terms of employment, but environmental damage. And we all know that the humaneness of this process ultimately will catch up on this. I went through about 4 years ago a huge avian issue, a bird flu issue in Iowa. We still haven't put our hands around the economic dislocation of that. But confining animals in that kind of circumstance and then having a disease outbreak is devastating. It's devastating for producers, it's devastating for communities, it's devastating for the public health, and that's exactly the track that you're going, unfortunately, when you see animal feeding operations on both the swine side and, in my view, also on the cattle side. Let me try to answer any questions or talk about whatever you want. Again, it's been a huge pleasure to be here. I love to ride down. I love riding around your beautiful community. My community took asphalt and put on all these beautiful brick streets about 20 years ago, so I love riding around. Now that I feel good just remembering that there's a great base underneath that street. Questions? Ma'am?
No, we don't have any leadership at the state in support of this. I mean, zero, none.
Right. The thought is that that's a pretty good description of a fear that the Iowa Department of Public Health has. The Iowa Department of Public Health has weighed in on a couple individual challenges, local community challenges against citing CAFOs, and frankly, the turntable is so heavily in favor of state law and so weak on any issues around local control or public health that they got beaten right back into the bush. And there have been several pieces of legislation that have been sponsored to defund the entire Iowa Department of Public Health. So you learn pretty quickly, reaching into that electric fan, unless you really can turn it off, is not a good thing. You keep losing fingers. And they have learned that, and realistically, what we have found when we need public health issues is we go to the university hospitals. And I assume that you have that same kind of capability maybe in Columbia. We do it through Iowa City. But those folks are also concerned, obviously, but they're separately funded and are a little bit more insulated from the legislature. But it is, we continue to make a public health issue here. We're not commodity providers, we're public health providers. This is absolutely critical, as you know, to your survival. So we say this is a public health issue. We've been able to get good help from the University of Iowa Hospital and clinics to be able to support that, and it really kind of ran around and away from the Iowa Department of Public Health because they're afraid of essentially losing their status at all as a state department. I'm afraid you're probably in a very similar kind of position here in Missouri. Ma'am?
Are the corn and soybeans from Iowa being used in these CAFOs?
Yes.
So it is a good deal?
I'm sorry, the question is, are CAFOs being fed by locally grown corn and soybeans? The answer is overwhelmingly yes. They're being sited in areas, obviously, where that corn and those soybeans are being raised. In my state also, huge renewable fuel issues. We're the largest ethanol producer, as an example, and half the corn that we produce is being used for ethanol production. Now, there are side stream things that go into feeding off of that, but very much the people who I know who are in the business, who are in industrial ag, they're raising their own corn, they're leasing or selling a small area where the CAFOs are coming in, and they're selling the feed stream right into the CAFO that they've just leased.
So they're out of the commodity market and they're getting better?
For a significant portion of it, yeah. I mean, they're realistically, most of the folks in my area of the world are large enough that they're playing it in several different ways. They're still in the commodity market on the futures side in particular, but are very much providing it as a feed stream for the CAFOs.
That's hard to find.
That's very hard to find.
But who is the consumer of the product of the CAFO, the major consumer? Does it stay here or is it going across sea?
China. I mean, China is the major consumer for our pork. And as you know, a lot of uncertainty right now about tariffs on pork, tariffs on soybeans. That's the uncertainty that I think you all and we need to take advantage of and say, hey, the economics that you're assuming are working here are not. We've got somebody in the White House, who thinks the Russians are our friends and the Canadians are our enemies. If that isn't discombobulating, I don't know what is. Sir?
Who owns all these staples? Is this in China? Are we selling a lot to China or what?
His question is, who owns the CAFOs? Are we selling our land to China? Largely what we find, Smithfield, which is Chinese-owned, is a large producer. There are a number of other large producers, a number of other large producers that have Iowa roots, like the ones who are looking at here at Galloway County as an example. At the end of the day, what happens is the land itself isn't being sold to the Chinese. It may be in a lease agreement, but nonetheless, we know where that beef is, or we know where that pork is going. It's really a large part going to China. And from my view, I think international trade is a great thing. I love international trade. I think it's good for all of us. I love free trade. The problem is we are underpricing our environment in this process that essentially makes us a captive colony of China in a lot of ways, because we are getting the pollutants in our water and in our air from raising Smithfield hogs that are going to Beijing.